So I was supposed to talk, it's supposed to be somewhat informal, but I thought I would tell you a little bit about what I do scientifically before I talk a little bit more personally about things. I'm a chemist and I work on electrons because electrons are the things that hold molecules together. So they make chemical bonds, they determine the energies that molecules have, the conformations that they have. And they obey the laws of quantum mechanics. So I end up doing a lot of chemistry, but also a lot of physics, trying to understand how electrons behave. And then the electronic states of molecules are also really important for converting energy from one form to another. So one of the big problems we work on is solar energy conversion, the conversion of sunlight into electricity or chemical fuels. And the big challenge we work on there is what I would call the energy problem, which is that global energy demand, by anyone's reckoning, is slated to increase over the next 90 years or so. And yet, we want to increase the supply of energy while decreasing our production of carbon dioxide. And that's a fairly difficult challenge given the kind of technologies that we have now. And so we try to take a look at emerging technologies, we break them down to a molecular scale, we look at the electronic states that are involved there, try to understand why things perform as they do, predict how they might perform better. And I get excited about those kinds of things, but that's not primarily what I'm here to talk about tonight. I'm here to tell you a little bit more about personal history. So I'll start my story near the beginning. So I grew up in Indianapolis, which on the map is right there, or about 2.5 hours down the freeway from here. People in Indiana, for those of you who have not ventured across the state border, people in Indiana are relentlessly friendly. So the saying goes in Indiana, if someone drives past you on a tractor and doesn't wave, it's probably because they only have one arm. And growing up, I went to church. As Mickey said, I went to a Presbyterian church. And probably the single most impressive thing about that church is the building. So here is a picture of the church that I went to growing up. It's a Gothic cathedral-style building placed on a hill coming up from downtown Indianapolis. You rise over this hill and you see the Second Presbyterian Church rising up above you. And so when I was a kid, I thought it was the coolest thing that I went to church in what was basically a medieval castle. I thought if I was God, that's probably the kind of house I would want to live in too. And when I was a kid, I had a pretty simplistic view of Christianity. I viewed it as something that I did for God. I tried to do well in school to make my teachers happy. I tried to keep my room clean to make my parents happy, and I went to church to make God happy. Okay, and when I graduated from high school, I decided I wanted to get out of Indiana and move someplace where it was going to be warmer. And so I went to college at Rice University, which is in Houston, which is there, definitely warmer in Houston. And when I was at Rice, I bounced around to a bunch of different churches. I went to Lutheran, Baptist, Episcopal, Presbyterian, Methodist churches. These were primarily determined by their distance from campus and how early their services were on Sunday morning. Earlier being worse. So that was where I was in college. And I should pause here and say that there were some other things going on for me during this time. When I was in high school and in college, I actually struggled quite a bit with depression. And in my second year of college, I had a fairly major depressive episode. I stopped being able to really eat or sleep. I was anxious all the time and I was flunking some of my classes. I was scared to talk to my friends about it. And so being a Christian, I prayed. I prayed that God would come in and help me. That I was in desperate need and I really needed God to come in and save me. So I prayed and prayed and prayed for several weeks that God would wave his magic wand and I would wake up and feel better. And from all those prayers, nothing happened. And I decided that if God wasn't going to do things for me, why, when it was really important, I wasn't being frivolous, it was something that was extremely important to me, but God couldn't be bothered to do something for me, why should I keep doing things for God? And so I quit going to church, I quit reading the Bible, I quit being a good kid. And I remember around that time reading the passage in Psalm 139, the one where it says, "Where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there." And I understand that the psalmist intended this to be a comforting passage, like God's always with you in your time of struggle. But for me, I knew that God, if he existed, was probably not very happy with what I was doing, and so his omnipresence was a bit of an annoyance. Where could I flee from his presence? Where could I hide? Apparently nowhere, according to this passage. So I thought about it for a while, and I thought, where can I hide from God? And finally I came up with the answer: graduate school. So I went to graduate school at UC Berkeley, which is over here. And when I was in graduate school, I continued to not go to church, continued to not read the Bible. I focused on my schoolwork, I focused on social life, I focused on dating, those kinds of things. And I did pretty well in the program. In my third year of graduate school, as I was getting ready to go into lab, something unusual happened because God spoke to me. Now, for those of you not familiar with different flavors of Christianity, this is pretty unusual because God doesn't usually speak to Presbyterians. Presbyterians are really good at studying the Word. We're really good about deciding things in committee. It's fine if God wants to speak to you, but we're not going to hold our breath and wait for that to happen. So it was really kind of jarring for me as a Presbyterian, and a lapsed Presbyterian at that, to feel that God spoke to me. And what he told me was that he wanted me to give up the things that I was relying on, which included my car, the money in my bank account, my retirement account, my wardrobe, my television, my VCR, my computer, my music collection. He wanted me to give up all those things, and he would lift me up. That was what he told me to do. And for me, that was my conversion experience. And I learned from that just a few things that I had wrong. I realized that following Jesus wasn't going to be about what I could do for God out of all the treasures I had stored up. Following Jesus was going to be about what God had done for me and what he was going to do with me. And so I did what God told me to do. I emptied out my bank account and my retirement account, my savings account and my retirement account. I sold my car, I sold my computer, I sold my television. I took all that money and I gave it away. I got rid of 90% of my wardrobe and 90% of my music collection, got rid of my computer. I gave all those things to charity. And for the following year, I was poor. Poorer even than your average graduate student. But I sure felt rich. And God didn't, at that time, though, tell me to drop out of school. So I kept on going to school, and I did pretty well, and I got a postdoc at Harvard, which is all the way here across the country. And I was a postdoc there for a couple of years, and then I got a faculty position at MIT, which on this map is basically the same location as Harvard. And I've been there ever since. So I've been there for 14 years now. Well, Harvard for 2 years, MIT for 14 years. So I've been there for a while. And so my physical journey has paused for a long time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but my spiritual journey has continued. And in particular, I've had to struggle with a particular question, which is this: what purpose could God have for me at MIT? What possible purpose could God have for a university professor? And I have to admit that for many years, this question caused me a fair bit of anxiety, because there are certain people who will report that they feel that God has called them to whatever their job is, that they'll use vocation, these fancy terms and stuff. And for me, God never called me to be a professor, or a chemist, or to go to graduate school, or if he did call me to those things, I wasn't listening at the time. And so I had significant doubts as to whether I was in the right vocation, whether God maybe really had all along wanted me to do something different, and maybe I had just not heard him. And indeed, part of me in the middle of this resonated with a desire to emulate the first disciples. Right, so the first disciples, they already had jobs. They were tax collectors or fishermen or things like that. And then Jesus walks up and says, "Follow me." And they all quit their jobs, leave everything on a dime, and go follow Jesus. And so I think in my heart of hearts, I thought that's what a real Christian would do. If you really converted to follow Jesus, you would leave your job immediately and just go, throw caution to the wind and go follow Jesus. So I think even part of me secretly relished the idea of doing this and there being a headline that said, MIT prof quits to help the poor. Wouldn't that be a headline that would get, the non-believers' attention? And so I prayed over this a lot. I was asking God if He wanted me to be doing something else. And to be honest, for a number of years, I felt kind of like a fake as a faculty member. Because God had never called me to be a faculty member, but I really wasn't quite coming up with anything else that He wanted me to do. And I didn't feel like He had a purpose for me. Because I think in my mind, there was a clear hierarchy in terms of how God viewed different professions. And I can just put it up on a PowerPoint slide. So I kind of thought that God viewed jobs like this. So at the very top of the list, definitely missionaries, right? So they give up everything, they go into hostile environments, risk life and limb to preach the gospel. God's really got to, love those missionaries. And then just below that would be pastors. They don't give up everything, but they're still, devoting their lives to preaching the gospel. And then below that would be people like social workers and doctors and nurses. They help other people. It's not exactly the gospel, but it's loving your neighbor and that kind of thing. And to find university professor, you have to go way, way, way down the list, and then you eventually find university professor down there. Somewhere above stockbroker and used car salesperson, right? Because as a university professor, I don't do anything that's all that useful. I spend most of my work week focusing on esoteric knowledge that maybe 200 people in the world are really going to appreciate or even understand. It's not saving souls, it's not even healing the sick, it's something that's small. And I prayed to see if God wanted me to quit doing this, apparently useless profession and, become a missionary or a pastor, a social worker, doctor, one of these, jobs that He clearly liked. And He never gave me a mission field to go to. He never gave me a church to pastor. He never made me feel like I'd be a very good social worker. And so I felt like I was kind of a failure because I'd never been called to the profession I was in, and God didn't seem to think I was good enough for any of the professions that actually were good. Until eventually, it struck me that maybe the lack of answer that I had was actually significant. That maybe if God wanted me to take a different job, He might tell me that He wanted me to take a different job. That there'd be some stirring in my heart to move, or there would be some opportunity that was too good to pass up, or barring any of those things, I knew for a fact that if He really wanted to, He could just tell me to do something. And those things hadn't happened. And so by process of elimination, maybe God had a purpose for me in this job that's apparently way, way down there on His priority scheme. And when I realized this, I started to pay a little bit better attention to the Bible, and I realized that the first disciples aren't the only example the Bible gives of people choosing to follow Jesus. And in fact, in the vast majority of cases where people follow Jesus, their call is not to leave, but to stay. So Paul instructs slaves to stay slaves, married people to stay married. It's only in specific instances that God actually calls people to leave their profession to do something else in order to follow Him. So John White says it this way in his essay, The Fight. He says, "It would seem that those whose call it was to leave their nets were to be as divinely gifted for their task as they were divinely called." So that is to say, if God wants you to be a missionary, He's going to divinely ordain you to be a missionary. He's going to give you something that's going to help you do that job. Because the truth is, you can't do any of these jobs to the glory of God without God's help. You can't just choose the job and say, I'm going to do this and it's going to bring you to glory of God. No, God has to help you do the job. You can't just show up in Calcutta and expect to become Mother Teresa. You have to be ordained by God to do that role. And so, by process of elimination, I concluded that God must have some purpose in having me stay in this profession, at least for now. But what is that purpose? And I'm guessing that many of you here might be struggling with a similar kind of question. We have all kinds of gifts. We're very educated. We have all kinds of opportunities. What are we supposed to do with that? What is our purpose in our careers and our lives? And I'm sorry to say that I do not have a complete answer to that question. So what purpose could God have for me as a professor? I'm still working on an answer to this, but I want to spend the last 15 minutes or so of my time standing up here talking, just sharing a few vignettes that have helped teach me something in the hopes that it might help you have some insight into what purpose God might have for you. So, in terms of thinking about my purpose as a professor, I think my earliest idea, or my earliest guess, would have been this, that maybe my purpose as a professor is to succeed. The idea being that if I am a super successful MIT professor, it will convince non-believers to follow Jesus. I even have Christians who have come up to me with exactly this thing, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm so glad to see a Christian at MIT. You'll show all those atheists that Christians can be just as smart as they are." So they clearly think that they know that my purpose is to be super successful. That if I'm successful, it will be a converting thing. But God has taught me that, in fact, my purpose is not necessarily to succeed. And if I had any doubt of this, my first few years at MIT, God really drove home that point, because my first several years at MIT were not a story of great success, but rather a story of a series of great failures. And my time at MIT was mostly about learning how to deal with those failures. So when I started, when I was a graduate student, I was a superstar graduate student. I was a great postdoc. I got a job at MIT, the #1 chemistry department in the country. And then I get there and I'm all excited to start up my research program. And indeed, that's a good thing, because in order to keep my job at MIT, I have to start up a world-renowned research program. They don't give you tenure at MIT just for showing up to work. And in order to judge whether you have a world-renowned research program, there's really two metrics that you can hang your hat on. One is grant funding. So you have to get grant funding to run a world-class research group. And the other thing you have to do is publish papers. And so when I started at MIT, my first grant that I submitted was rejected, along with my second grant, my third grant, and my fourth grant. My first two papers were also rejected. And this all happened over the course of about 18 months. And towards the end of that time, I started to feel really anxious, because the clock was ticking. If I wanted to get something done in time to maybe make tenure, it needed to happen soon. And the money the startup money I was using to pay the bills was running out. And if I ran out of money, then the train goes off the rails. And so I prayed. I said, "God, help me. You didn't send me to MIT just to fail, just to wash out, did you?" And God's response was, "Maybe I did." And that was an answer to prayer, not exactly the answer I had been hoping for, but it made me realize that maybe my purpose is not to succeed. And in this, I learned two things. First, I learned how much stronger my faith is when things are not going well than when they are going well. So there's no more heartfelt prayer than the desperate prayer you give when you know you are drowning. And the second thing that I learned was that I had better figure out how to invite God into the day-to-day parts of my work. Because I knew if God was with me, at least the work that I was doing would have some purpose. That even if I failed, I could have the freedom to fail, because God was with me. That if I failed, I knew that I could fail gloriously. And so, after a while, things did get better for me at MIT. I did get grant funding, I did publish the papers, I did make tenure. As it happens right now, things are not going as well. I've had a number of grants get pulled over the last few months, and so I'm back in the same kind of place where I'm like, "God, help!" And maybe I have to accept that. I've had to accept from the beginning, though, that whether or not I get those grants, my purpose is not to succeed. It's not how I am ultimately going to be judged by God. And so, I think we can easily be fooled in this regard, though. In the same essay, John White said it perfectly. He said, "The idea seems to be that success is what convinces. That if the Christian student can get straight A's, then her testimony will count. One shines for Jesus at the top of the tree. The successful Christian billionaire convinces all the unconverted millionaires that Jesus is real and powerful. But powerful to do what? Get us all straight A's? By that standard, most followers of Jesus are failures and will forever remain so. So where does this misconception come from? Well, if I'm honest with myself, I often think that God is getting something out of my work. That if I work really, really hard and do really, really well, God will somehow be impressed with me or benefit from all of the work that I'm doing. But the reality is that that's not true at all. God doesn't get anything out of the work that I'm doing. He could do it by himself far better than I can do it myself. And the truth is that my work is one of my gifts from God rather than my gift to God. And the scriptural basis for this is that, God at the end of the race talks about being well pleased with us. He doesn't talk about being well impressed with us. And being pleased is very different than being impressed. And this recognition that my work or my vocation is a gift from God has really formed the basis about how I think about my work and my faith. And instead of thinking about what I can accomplish for God, I think about how I can share my enjoyment of this gift with the giver of that gift. So I'm reminded here of a time when I was a child, and I really, really wanted some Incredible Hulk tennis shoes. And my mom bought me the tennis shoes for my birthday or something like this, and I opened the box, and I got them out, and I put on the shoes, and I wanted my mom to come outside immediately to see how fast I could run in my new tennis shoes. Now, I guarantee you that my mom was not impressed with how fast I could run in my Incredible Hulk tennis shoes. In fact, I can almost guarantee you that I was not one step faster in the new tennis shoes than in my perfectly good old tennis shoes. But it was the right desire of my heart to share my pleasure in having this gift with the person who gave it to me. To say that I am pleased and I wanted my mom to be pleased too. And it's the same way in my work. It is the right desire of my heart to invite the giver of the gift into the work so that the giver can be just as pleased with the work as I am. And so that's one of the central things that I've learned. Of course, it's not always this simple because there are certainly times where I feel like MIT or Northwestern might pull in one direction and I might feel like God or church or Jesus might be pulling in the opposite direction. MIT might want me to work long hours. God might want me to spend more time with my family. MIT might want me to fight, to compete, to win all the time, and God might want me to help be a little bit content with losing sometimes. How do I balance these things? How do I, in practice, put those things together? Well, sometimes, in the extreme, we can lose a little bit of faith, and being a Christian in a university setting can feel something like this. So this is a quote that I took from the web, so it must be true. No, it's a quote that I think encapsulates the way I modified it a little bit, and it goes like this. It says, "For me, combining faith and leadership is not possible in academics. It comes down to this: academics is about learning things and impressing people. Gospel-based faith is about making relationships in justice. The two are oil and water." And certainly there are times where we might feel like this in an academic setting. And if this is true, then my purpose in academia is going to be a little bit shallow. I can enjoy learning things, I can give it my best effort, and I can share that enjoyment with God. But the fruit of my effort doesn't really count for much in the grand scheme of things because it's not this gospel-based faith, making relationships in justice. It's, in this respect, being a professor would be a lot like playing the video game Space Invaders. How many of you guys have ever played Space Invaders? How many of you know what Space Invaders is? Okay, so I'll have to explain. Space Invaders was a very early video game where you were apparently the only person who noticed that the entire Earth was being invaded by space aliens, and you controlled the only defenses against these invaders, and your goal was to defend the planet from the advancing space invaders who came from the top of the screen, and you had to shoot them before they hit the bottom of the screen. Okay, so Space Invaders, video game, it is a fun video game. You can enjoy playing Space Invaders, and it takes a lot of skill to get the high score in Space Invaders. But in And so you can enjoy playing it. You can give it your best effort. You could even, if you really were like deep into Space Invaders, you could share your enjoyment of playing Space Invaders with God. Say, God, thank you for creating Space Invaders. This is a wonderful game. But in the end, your skill at Space Invaders wouldn't really count. Because, in the construct of the game, they pretend that you're saving the world, but no matter how long you play Space Invaders, no matter how high you push that score, you're never actually going to save the world by playing Space Invaders. Because it's a game. And I think for many academics, both Christian and not, academics is just that. It's a game. It's a game with arbitrary rules that you play by. It's a game where the goal is to accumulate a high score. And whether that score is measured by your grade point average, or your score on a particular test, or the number of papers you write, or the number of awards you win, it's a score, and it's a score that no one really expects to matter outside of our little cohort of fellow game players. And I enjoy playing this game of university life, but I think that there is more to our purpose here than just playing a game. Indeed, most of the early universities in the US were founded on the idea that higher education was more than a game. So with that in mind, does anyone here know Northwestern's motto?
Oh, with the current one?
No, like the old...
Methodist.
Huh?
You were the fighting Methodist.
Oh, okay, well there's that. That's like the Latin motto. Or even the translation of the Latin motto. Nobody knows, huh?
It's true, or whatever is true.
That's true. So it's Que quorum sunt vera, I think? Something like that. My Latin is terrible, and I didn't write that one down. So, but it's a direct quote from Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Whatever is true, that is what we ought to seek. So at Harvard's motto is popularly said to be Veritas, truth. That's actually a shortened version of the motto. The actual motto is Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae, which is truth for Christ and the church. Another couple ones here. Princeton's motto is Dei sub numine viget, under God's power she flourishes. And Columbia's motto is In lumine tuo videbimus lumen. In your light we see light. So there's a deep sense in which the university has taken an education that was originally oriented towards God and reoriented it towards a set of artificial rules and a set of artificial goals of this sort of game-playing attitude. And maybe part of my purpose, part of our purpose, is to reconstruct that original purpose, to rediscover ways that learning and knowledge and study can be a divinely ordained activity. And I don't just mean studying the Bible, I also mean studying physics and chemistry and economics and philosophy. Maybe all of these things are meant to be more than we are taught in our education that they actually can amount to. And for me, this idea that my academic study is meant to be more than I think it is, has actually really motivated the way that I choose research projects. So every time I come to a research project, the question I ask, and the question that I encourage my students to ask, is why does this matter? If everything works out, if the project succeeds, if it accomplishes all of its aims, what's going to be different about the world? Whose lives are going to be changed? How will my life be different? And if all of those happen, will I be gratified by the result? Will I feel some sense of fulfillment? And if the answer is no, maybe it's not such a good project to work on. And this is really the thing that has led me to devote so much of my effort to solar energy, because it's a problem that matters to millions of people. It matters to our planet. It's a big problem. It's a difficult problem. It's more than I would normally think I could accomplish, because it's such a big problem that it's a bit audacious for me to say as a theoretical chemist that I'm going to write down some equations, solve some equations, do a few simulations, and somehow make a difference to this absolutely staggeringly huge problem. But it is that sort of audacious vision that academic study was originally intended to approach. The idea, because there was originally the idea that the academic vocation had a specific role, that it could do things that other vocations couldn't. Because academic vocation encompasses the idea that more than any other profession, by following this vocation, we change the way that we think. both about what is and about what could be. And if I come to my academic vocation, I'm still limited by whatever I thought was possible before I came there, I'm not going to accomplish everything in this vocation that I was meant to. And so taking these kinds of audacious risks, I think, is what we were meant to do. It's the divinely inspired role of study, and I think anything less than this is, somehow less. It's somehow not what we were meant to do, and it's, something like playing Space Invaders. So, all right, that's all I had to share. So I'd be happy to take questions or sit around and chat, whatever you guys would like to do. Thanks.
You actually had some people write questions in as they RSVP'd for the event.
Oh,
So
okay.
I can pull those up, but feel free, just getting the ball rolling.
So when you were at Berkeley and you kind of had that transitional moment, like what was going on in your heart that made you want to do that? Because it seems like up to that point you weren't interested in what God was offering.
There's a very complex mix of emotions. One of them was fear, because, and it's something that I have since had never noticed before, but have since noticed quite readily, which is that every time there's an encounter between God and a human in the Bible, the first thing that comes out of either an angel or a theophany's mouth is, "Do not be afraid," because when I was there, I was like, well, I just talked to God, and I know He's probably not very happy with me. It's one thing to think that God's far off and is not going to intervene until maybe the very, very end of the game. So like I could just live my life however I want, and then He'll intervene at the end, and maybe I'll pay the price someday. But now it's like I had evidence that He could intervene in the middle if He wanted to, and He could intervene for my good or for my not so good. And not that I thought that God would be punitive in any unjust way. I would have thought that He would have been justified in doing some of those things at that point. And so I felt both fear and also the sense of grace that I felt that God would have been justified to punish me, but He chose not to do that. So those I think for me were the motivating things. But it was the fear, not in the it was a fear in the awe sense of fear, not in the cowering to avoid punishment kind of thing. It was just the idea that there is an awesome God who could really just drop the hammer on me, and He's choosing not to.
So one of the first questions, I'm just going to chronology. Some of these you may have already touched on.
Yeah.
So if you feel like you've said enough, that's fine, or you can say some more. First question is, I'm often tempted to believe that to be taken seriously as both a Christian and a scientist when talking about my faith, I should first have a lot of academic credentials. What has been your experience sharing your faith with your colleagues in academia, particularly when you were early in your career?
I think that certainly, I'm an unusual case in that I happen to have landed in a position through not a lot of, there's a lot of luck involved in where I am and where I've gotten in my career. And so I happen to have fairly good academic credentials. And so I can't necessarily do the thought experiment of how people would have responded if I didn't have good academic credentials. But I can say that it's not, I can't think of a single case where somebody was more receptive to the gospel because I'm so smart. I think maybe if there's anything that it's done, probably it makes people a little bit more reticent to be critical of the gospel in my presence. Just because they're like, well, Troy, he's, MIT professor, and, we can go ahead and talk smack when he's not around. But I can't say that that's what they're doing or not, but, I think people have been fairly respectful of Christianity when I've been around. And in terms of, sharing my faith, I think every time that I've been effective at sharing my faith, it's been getting beyond anything that has to do with academic credentials, and whether or not, and sometimes it's my credentials that get in the way, not my lack of credentials that get in the way of getting beyond those things. Because maybe somebody knows my credentials and therefore always wants to talk about quantum mechanics and solar energy and theory and computer programming and stuff. I'm like, no, let's talk about Jesus, and it just never gets there.
Set of 3 questions here, somewhat related. How do you, and relate to this last question, how do you share your faith within your workplace, among your colleagues, like how would you go about doing that? How do you glorify, second question, how do you glorify God throughout the process of doing research? Such an essential. How does your faith influence your research direction, and how does your research influence your view of God?
Mm-hmm. So I think I gave everything well, most everything I've got on that middle one. How do I work on glorifying God through the process of my work? Still something I'm working on, but it's something that does consume a great deal of my thought, because I feel like our purpose is to glorify God in everything that we do. And so if my work isn't glorifying Him, it's kind of a waste. In terms of how I share faith, I think one of the things that I guess there's a few things. So one is that you might think that as a faculty member, I am uniquely positioned to share my faith with other faculty. That actually turns out not to be that true, because faculty members don't really interact with each other that much. If you think about the faculty, and you think, oh, they're so busy. And so you have faculty member A who's really busy and faculty member B who's really busy, and generally we're busy with two completely distinct set of activities. And so the amount of time that we actually spend in the same room talking about anything is very small compared to any other set of coworkers in virtually any other profession. And this is partly because if you wanted to have an analogy of what kind of position a faculty member is, it's like we're all CEOs of small businesses. They're all small businesses in the same consortium of businesses, but we're not all managers within the same company. We are CEOs of our own companies. And so we don't have to meet with each other very often, and so we don't. So that means that, with the exception of a few of my colleagues, I don't have really strong personal relationships, just by dint of not having a lot of interaction time. There have been a few opportunities I've had to sort of slip things in. I had one of my colleagues went through a fairly painful divorce. I was able to talk to him a little bit when that was going on. I have another. We've been over to his house for dinner. He's a friend, and I have another friend who I was just starting to, build some bridges with him, and then he moved to Chicago. So, I think again, it's for me, all the effective evangelism or sharing of faith has to be within the context of a relationship where you're also sharing other, victories and defeats and struggles and joys. Those things need to, you need to have all of those things going together for it to take root. And then that was the first one, and then the third one was.
How does your faith influence your research direction, and how does your research influence your view of God?
Yeah, so I think for me particularly, I shared the example of moving towards solar energy. So for me, it's helped in the sense that I'm in an esoteric field, and so it's helped me to think about how that esoteric field really goes deep into some bigger problems. There may be others of you out there where you're working on something where it has clear boots on the ground kind of influence. Like I gave a similar thing like this, and there was one person. So I'm in the School of Nursing. So it was one of those top 5 professions there. So everybody there is clear that we have a mission, and I can feel like we're helping people. It's it's something that Jesus would be happy about. So then, how might it change what I do? And I said, well, it may be the exact opposite call for them, in that there are nurses who are. If you're going to be a nurse in a nursing school, how is that different than being a nurse? Why would you do that instead of just being a nurse? And what are the things that you can do that are unique to being an academic institution about nursing? That's the unique calling of academia there. And I think that there is also that side of things, where if you're in something that's very pragmatic, very applied, and so forth, trying to figure out, well, what is it? What are the underlying ideas here that are unique to my academic study of this? And because for one thing I found for me is that it only occurred to me in just the last couple of years that I really enjoy the process of thinking, just about anything. Just like sitting around and ruminating and thinking is very pleasant to me. It's relaxing, and it's relaxing in terms of my prayer life. I get a lot of joy out of contemplative prayer. Where I'm not coming in with a list of requests or things I want to cover. I'm just thinking about God and what He might want and what I might want, what I might want out of what I might be seeking in Him. And I think that dovetails well with the profession that I have, which is one where I get to think a lot.
So I guess I have the power now. Just on a follow-up question, you mentioned that you share, like the evangelism comes from sharing pains or successes. And so like I think like you said, you're CEO of a small company, so you have limited time. How do you deliberately, or how do you develop relationships and friendships that you can have those experiences and opportunities to share?
Yeah, well, and then there's that's the other side of things, which is that there is actually a unique platform that I have that's not colleague-based sharing, but the fact that I am a little bit on a pedestal in the profession and the position that I'm in. So there are people that look to me just because of the position that I'm in, not because they know me well. So one instance of this is, so for those of you who were at the forum last night, my son had a significant health problem when he was an infant, and because there were so many people that I wanted to keep abreast of this, I mean, I started emailing people every few days as this condition was going, because I was out of work and I wanted people at work to know, and they wanted to be updated and stuff. So I emailed people, and then eventually I started a blog, and we were very transparent in the blog about how our faith was playing into how we viewed this, and there were friends of ours who were Christians and friends of ours who were not, and we were just like, well, we're going to ask people to pray. For those who are comfortable praying, we're going to ask them to pray, and it was actually kind of interesting because there were at least a few people who got wind of this who I didn't know were Christians who were like, well, I will pray. And some of them still ask me to this day, how's he doing? And so that was just something where just me being in the position that I'm in and sharing what we were going through in a platform that people was publicly visible was, I think, a good testimony to that. And I was actually kind of convicted in that I had another friend who had gone through something actually just a year before that, where he had been diagnosed with a stage 4 malignant brain tumor, inoperable stage 4 brain tumor. Of course, and he was 28 years old, had a 1-year-old daughter, and was, had 6 months to live. And he wrote a series of blog posts about, the different diagnoses, and what he expected to be probably his final coherent blog post, because he was going in for surgery where they were going to at least try to do something, and he just said, look, if I die, I want to make sure that you all know that Jesus Christ is real and powerful, and you should follow him. He's like, that's what I want everyone to know. And he said this to all his academic peers and everything. I was like, I don't know that I would have had the guts to send that email, but just the fact that he sent that, just to everybody. He didn't just send it in an evangelical way. He sent it to all his friends, some of whom were Christians and some of whom were not. And that particular form of testimony when he was in that struggle was I think, pretty powerful and also just pretty true to who he was. And so I think even if we don't have relationships, being transparent about struggles and things that we go through in our faith and in our lives can be a big testimony.
What about sharing with your students as well? And what is, you obviously have this relationship that you have with people that you're mentoring. When does your faith sort of play a role in that?
Yes, so I have to be careful about those things because, again, because of position,
Right.
that, and this is not, and people you'll sometimes hear people grouse about the law and how it's illegal to do this and that. I think it's actually good that there are laws limiting the degree to which people in positions of authority can share with those in positions who are underneath them. And good for Christianity, because historically, Christianity has not flourished when people with authority enforce Christianity on people who don't have the authority. Christianity dies when that happens. It flourishes when the people who are not in authority embrace Christianity and then force the authorities to accept it. And so I try to be very careful when I'm talking about matters of faith with my students that it's clear that I'm taking off any form of faculty authority or inequality or something like that, and then I'm just sharing in a peer-to-peer fashion, because otherwise I think it's not going to be very effective. Now there are situations, so I don't do it in class because it's clear that I hold the power of their grade, and I think it would be. But there are times in class, like I was teaching class, like I gave a Veritas forum at MIT once, and so students knew that, or I might advertise that there is a Veritas forum, or mention that, and encourage them to go, or something like that. And so word gets around, and they hear about these things. But I try in a class setting not to do anything that would be viewed as proselytizing, or even perceived as proselytizing by students. But when students are really having difficulty and come to my office, I might offer to pray with them if I perceive that that might be something that would be beneficial to them. And some of them are curious about, well, you did that Veritas thing, and what, ask a question, and I can share a little bit about that.